Well, hello. So glad we get to continue our study of the miracles of Jesus. We get to continue to look at his miracles of healing, his miracles of great power that demonstrate not only his authority, but also begin to continue to expand his ministry. And so we got the opportunity yesterday to look at the healing of the Syrophoenician woman's daughter, which really we don't even see the daughter. The focus really is on the fact that this Canaanite woman is asking Jesus for healing. And so we see how that was used by Matthew and Mark to show the disciples, in particular, the apostles, their growing role in ultimately ministering to the Gentiles as well as to the Jews. We're going to see a similar miracle today. It's going to take only place in Mark. And so it takes place right after the miracle of the Syrophoenician woman. It's almost kind of a second part to that story. And so we're going to see Jesus still in this Gentile region. It's actually the same Gentile region he was in earlier when he healed the demoniac. That's going to come up in just a moment. But we see Jesus continuing to minister to the Gentiles, even though he's made this comment that, I've come only to the Jews. Mark is clearly demonstrating that he is also faithful to the Gentiles. He is also here for people. He is also here to heal the Gentiles. And so even though there is a clear element of Jewish preference, there's also a clear element that this is about to expand into something much more. Let's go ahead and take a look at what Mark says here. In Mark chapter 7 and verse 31, again, right after the healing of the Syrophoenician woman, it says, "Again he went out from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee within the region of Decapolis. They brought to him one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty, and they implored him to lay his hand on him. Jesus took him aside from the crowd by himself, put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, he touched his tongue with the saliva. Looking up to heaven with a deep sigh, he said to him, 'Ephphatha,' that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, and the impediment of the tongue was removed, and he began speaking plainly. He gave them orders not to tell anyone, but the more he ordered it, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. They were utterly astonished, saying, 'He has done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak.'" So we see Jesus has left Tyre and Sidon, which is kind of on the coastline. He's crossed back over the Sea of Galilee, but he's actually over here in the eastern part of it in this region called the Decapolis. We saw this earlier in Mark where he had crossed the Sea of Galilee after he had calmed the storm, and he had preached in that area, and this was where he healed the demoniac. And he ended up making that demoniac, after he had been healed, into essentially kind of the first disciple, the first messenger of the good news to the Gentiles. And so clearly, his reputation has spread in this area. And so it's not explicitly said, but I think we can see that that disciple was faithful, that he did keep proclaiming, because as soon as he comes to the region, people are coming up to him. They're like, "Hey, we know what you can do. We know you can heal people. Can you heal our friend here?" And it's a sad sight. We see this man who is both deaf and essentially mute. And so it's interesting, though, that his friends are faithful, and we've seen in other miracles that Jesus has typically had some sort of discussion with the individual. Obviously here that would be a little bit more difficult, but we do see Jesus still acting on the faith of the friends, and really, obviously the miracle takes place because this man has faith. And I think that's a cool note of Jesus being able to see, despite not being able to hear this man, and this man not being able to hear Jesus, he still knows this man has faith, which is incredible. That this man who truly cannot hear or cannot speak about what Jesus is saying outside of obviously sign language, that he still believes, he still has faith. That's a pretty incredible statement of faith about this man. And so they bring this guy to him, and it goes through this kind of interesting miracle process because he's going to take him aside. And we've seen, again, Jesus does this sometimes, kind of part of this whole idea of the messianic secret, not trying to make himself seem like purely a faith healer, but he takes him aside, and then he does a very interesting thing where he puts his fingers into his ears. He then spits, puts the saliva on his tongue. It's kind of from our modern germophobic culture, it's kind of a gross statement. Why would this be happening? Well, if you actually look back in Isaiah chapter 35, this is one of those kind of cultural context things that we might not know intrinsically, but there's a pretty widely held belief in the Jewish culture that the spittle of the prophets, because it was, what was produced with the word of God and with them speaking, that was holy, that could bring about healing. Now, there's no specific mention of that in the prophets, so I don't know if it's really a very accurate statement or not, but those are kind of a widely held belief there. And so Jesus, through this action of the ears and the tongue, seems to be very explicitly linking himself to what Isaiah says in Isaiah 35 and verse 5, where Isaiah is prophesying about the future happiness of Zion. He says, "Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will shout for joy. For waters will break forth from the wilderness, and streams in the Arabah." And so this was one of the signs of kind of this messianic age to come was, the unstopping of ears and the unmuting of tongues. And so Jesus doing this is confirming that this is happening not just in Judea, but it's happening even in the Gentile areas as well. Again, further reinforcing this idea that Jesus's salvation, his ministry, is first to the Jews, but to the Greeks and to the Gentiles also. And that's going to be what the apostles are obviously going to expand into in the book of Acts. It's also interesting that after he does this, he puts his finger in the ear and he touches his saliva to the tongue. He then looks up to heaven with a deep sigh. And this is really evocative language because I think twofold. You see, one, it shows the emotion of Jesus. And we've seen this before in the Gospels where Jesus has been moved by compassion, where he has been outraged by the workings at the temple. He has been frustrated with his disciples. And I think a lot of times we get this very sanitized version of Jesus that, it's the artwork that shows him always calm and never very emotional. And I don't think that's a very accurate picture. We see in the Gospels, Jesus deeply feels. He is deeply emotional about what happens. And so seeing, the consequences of creation and the corruption of creation, he's moved by it. He looks to heaven and he just deeply sighs. And you can see it's both the emotion and also the dependence upon God's power for the healing. But we see a real glimpse in this just very brief description of the character of Jesus, that this is not just something to him. This is his creation. He's upset at what's happened to his people. He's upset at the destruction that sin has wrought in his world. And he feels that. And he's emotional about that. And I think that's worth noting, that Jesus cares. That he's not this far-off, distant, unfeeling God. He came to earth. He felt everything. He saw everything. He touched everything. He understood the pain that people were going through. And as we know later on in the story, he's going to feel in much more amplified ways that same pain that we do. And so when we relate to Jesus, when we talk about Jesus, he cares. He feels. He is emotional about his creation. And I think that's an enormously important thing for us to recognize. He then says this phrase, ephatha, which is Aramaic, which is why that original language is preserved there. Typically, the Gospels are recorded in Greek. Occasionally, you'll have original Aramaic sayings, which is one of the languages that was spoken in this region. And so Mark is almost kind of putting us into the situation. This is what we would have literally heard Jesus say. It probably is not pronounced the way that I'm pronouncing it because I have no idea how to pronounce it Aramaic. So I don't know if it's ephatha or not, but that's how I'm reading it. And so it's be opened, and immediately this man is healed. His ears are open. His tongue begins to speak. And again, we see Jesus give this order that he typically does. Say, hey, don't tell anyone. Keep this to yourself. This isn't supposed to, I'm not doing this for attention. I'm doing this so that you'll be healed. But people can't help themselves. In fact, it says the more he ordered it, the more widely they continue to proclaim it. It's this weird kind of, I guess, commentary on human nature that, you tell them to do something, they do the opposite of it. But in this case, they can't help but talk about God. And notice what they say. It says they were utterly astonished, saying, he has done all things well. Doesn't that sound a lot like the creation language of Genesis 1 and 2? Where when God creates something, when God does something, it's good. It's very good. Here, when Jesus does something, he has made things well. It's kind of this recreation language that Jesus has come here to renew the creation. He has come to fix the problem of sin in all of its facets, including the damage it has done to people physically. But what we're going to see is he's also going to fix the damage done to them spiritually. And so we see that in this brief miracle, we get really a deep insight into who Jesus is, his emotion. We see his concern with fulfilling the prophecies. But we also see that his ministry is really recreation. It's God again creating and removing the wickedness and purifying the terrible things of the earth and replacing them with the good and recreating them in that original Edenic image. And so one of the things we are going to see, and we're going to make a note of this, probably not next time, but the following lesson, is Mark is going to link this miracle very closely with another miracle that's going to involve touch and spittle, but this time healing a man who's born blind. And that's going to be a really important miracle that's going to ultimately prompt that great confession of Peter. So that's kind of what we're building up here. So tomorrow we'll talk about the feeding of the 4,000, which is another big connection there. And then we're going to talk about that healing of the blind man in Mark, which, spoiler alert, is one of my absolute favorite miracles. It's an incredible story. I just love telling it. It's such a good one. So we'll focus on that in a couple of days. Thank you so much for taking the time to study these things. So appreciative of everybody's continued attention through this. It's been a long time that we've been doing this now. We've been doing this for 2 months, almost every day, except for those days that I have technical difficulties. And you guys have stuck with it. And I really am genuinely appreciative of that. I'm so thankful for the zeal for God's word that you all continue to have in this time. And I'm grateful that we continue to be able to do these things, continue to study these things. Again, cannot wait until this Sunday where we get to study together again for the first time in a long time together in person. Thank you guys so much for watching. We pray it was edifying for you. We love you guys. We'll see you again next time.